everybody. I warmly welcome you to the second video production of Great Literary Classics produced by the Department of Language Studies. Today, we are going to discuss the Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. And with me, I have in the studio Dr. Melissa Schindler from the University of North Georgia. She's Associate Professor of English. And we also have Ms. Nipuni Ranavira from the Department of Language Studies. Okay, Jane Eyre book begins with this very powerful sentence. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day, and almost ends with a walk. If I can locate it, it almost, we entered the wood and wended homeward. So with that in mind, with that interlocking intertextuality in mind, I would like to ask you, this is a very powerful feminist text, but a novel written in 1847, is it still relevant in the 21st century literature classroom? Let us ask our panelists here today.
Yeah, so I think it's even on this day and age, it's difficult to conceive of an English canon without the existence of Jane Eyre. So automatically, if you are either a scholar reading English literature or a teacher teaching it, it's widely assumed that Jane Eyre would be part of your teaching and learning experience. I think it has partly to do with the fact that it's such an engaging and very compelling novel, both in terms of content and the certain literary techniques used, and the fact that it's a very dramatic tale, and it's also it happens to be a very fully fledged story. It's not short or sort of abridged, and it takes you through the full sort of very extensive sort of cycle of the life cycle of the protagonist, I would say. And it's also conceived of, it's also understood to be one of the classical path-breaking feminist novels. So I think it actually sort of gave rise to several traditions, literary traditions in writing. So not just a tradition that would maybe interest feminists, but also it I think gave new meanings and new definitions to how romance literature is written, how to write a literary text that is romantic, and as well as it sought and sort of revisited many issues that women of that era went through, which are not necessarily sort of limited or restricted to actually women of that era. So I think this degree of universality and the fact that it's a very compelling and a very arresting read, sort of justifies its position in the canon today, and the fact that we read it and engage with it even today.
Yeah. Thank you, Nipuni. Let's talk to Melissa.
Yeah, I think this novel is still very exciting because even though it was path-breaking at its time, it has themes that we still care very much about today. It's a story of a woman who started from nothing and kind of made her way in the world. It's the story of learning about yourself, so very much in tune with things that we care about today, like self-love and self-care. And it's the story of being loved for the person you are. This is one of I think the best things about this novel. We repeatedly hear about how Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester, her love interest, they're not very attractive. That's what is said over and over in the novel, but yet they love each other, they choose each other. And so I think that lesson is still something we care about very much today.
Okay, so very interesting. So we began our discussion with the relevance of Jane Eyre. Now I move into something very critical issue in literature, the connection between the social setting that created the novel and the novel itself. So I mean, it's a contested understanding. So let me be very bold and unromantic and ask you whether is Jane Eyre a romantic, unrealistic, and even a passionate work removed from the realities of Victorian society? How would you respond to that? We'll start from Melissa, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because sometimes we read Jane Eyre and it seems almost like these things are impossible, right? This love story, the way that it's told, there are a lot of coincidences that happen in the novel that frankly seem unrealistic. And sometimes people react to that in ways that they're a bit surprised by it. They're like, come on, this novel can't be something that could actually happen. And yet the passion that Jane Eyre feels, all of her emotions, the passion that Mr. Rochester feels, and all of the characters really is so accurate. Think about what it's like to be, say, a teenager and going through all these emotions and experiences. This is very realistic. We go through this often on our own. We feel it internally. But what Charlotte Bronte has done here is to externalize it. Think about the films that we watch today, or the theater that we go to. These pieces often, say, in the US, we have what we call musicals. And sometimes people think of them as sort of cheesy. Bollywood movies, for instance, lots of music that externalizes our emotions. That's really what I feel Jane Eyre is doing, or Charlotte Bronte is doing through Jane Eyre. She's externalizing the inner passions that we feel. So although it may seem unrealistic, many of us feel those emotions. So I think it is real in that sense. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Nipuni, how would you?
Yeah, so I think one of the, while agreeing with what Melissa says, one of the things I think we have to remember is that Charlotte Bronte wrote at a time when it was very, very uncommon for women writers to actually write, and I guess even more uncommon for them to actually get around to publishing. And I think as students, you all know how difficult it is for a woman, even in this age, to actually to find the time and the sort of the means to start a writing career, and then we have to conceive how difficult it would have been for somebody like Charlotte Bronte to actually write, and then to think about getting her work out there to publish and all that. So we do know that her works were, I mean, that she used the pseudonym Carabel, passing herself off as a man, as a masculine figure. I think chiefly to sort of align herself with the idea that it was men who wrote, that it was largely like a very patriarchal sort of tradition that went with writing, with the act of writing. So that was something reserved for men. So if you were a woman, I think you see that even in Jane Austen, you see this half apologetic, half sort of defensive stance when you start writing. So with that, I think you are more or less very concerned about, I guess, the literary techniques you use. On one hand, I think you are somebody like Charlotte Bronte would have definitely been sort of influenced by the writing traditions that were around at the time. She wouldn't have been able to, I guess, ignore them completely. But then again, we find what we find worthy in her novels is the way she somehow gets around them. So like Melissa said, like Dr. Melissa said, the narrative techniques, the over the top, the emotional, the scenes, the drama, the passion. So this is all, I guess, a part of part of the Victorian literary traditions, and we do get them, these miraculous reunions and the other the coincidences, the dramatic sort of the dramatic exclamations and all that. So I think it's so with this, I think Charlotte Bronte has sort of got for herself this sort of reputation that she's a like a very romantic writer who sort of goes into overtures. But at the same time, actually I had this I was reading this quote from Terry Eagleton, who seemed to believe that we have this quote from him. He says, "The Brontes were not then three weird sisters deposited upon the Yorkshire moors from some metaphysical outer space. On the contrary, their lives were shaped by some of the most typical conflicts of early Victorian England." So he seems to feel that the certain realities that actually affected Victorian women can be found within her characters and her themes. So I think you have to take it. I think it's not that she does sort of adhere to some of the literary traditions that were there, and you find that she does really. And for me, of course, personally, sometimes it's one of the appealing things about her works. Also, the fact that she sort of vents her emotions, and that she's very open about how passionate she is and all that. But at the same time, they are not. I wouldn't say that they are removed from reality in that sense. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I mean, we just, if I may summarize, so this is this whole notion of possibilities in life, finding certain expressions in literary text and suddenly touching a nerve in the reader. So we just discussed that possibility. So with that, we go to the third section of this video.
My vacations had all been spent at school. Mrs. Reed had never sent for me to Gateshead. Neither she nor any of her family had ever been to visit me. I had had no communication by letter or message with the outer world. School rules, school duties, school habits and notions and voices and faces and phrases and costumes and preferences and antipathies, such was what I knew of existence. And now I felt that it was not enough. I tired of the routine of 8 years in one afternoon. I desired liberty. For liberty I gasped. For liberty I uttered a prayer. It seemed scattered on the wind, then faintly blowing. I abandoned it and framed a humbler supplication for change, stimulus. That petition too seemed swept off into vague space. Then, I cried, half desperate, grant me at least a new servitude.
Okay, we now come to a question that Nipuni raised, or rather the suggestion that Nipuni raised about Jane Eyre being a female, writing as a male, right? Obviously that would have had an effect on the writer. So which brings me to this question: what do we know about, or what can we tell the audience about the conditions that shape the possibilities of a female novel for females in the Victorian society, social, political, economic? So we'll start with Nipuni.
Yeah, so I guess we have to, sort of perceive how complex really the social and the political sort of landscape of Victorian England was, because it was on one hand a very, very rapidly changing sort of social, I would say, canvas, and you see if you do, I mean, because we always suggest to our students that they should read up a little bit on history, and then as well as other sort of associated factors when you are studying a novelist. And here there's no difference. So so you find on one hand the English society being affected by the Industrial Revolution that was going on, which I think as far as women writers or women characters in a novel are concerned, which really which really made women, the focus of this idea of work come out, as a very prominent sort of factor in the novels as well. So you find a lot of revolutionary, I guess, things happening around the concept of work. So I guess this idea of men of the household going out to work, which led to the females in the house, being more and more confined to the house. And then we say that this idea of the angel of the house, I think this was sort of suggested by Patmore, if I'm not mistaken, who says that this idea of a woman sort of residing inside within the Victorian house as a mother, as an ideal mother and an ideal woman, became very, very popular actually in Victorian society. So you get, and then people like Charlotte Bronte being women who wrote, again, focusing on women, on women's lives inside houses. So that's also something that you have to remember, houses and the fact that women are sort of enshrined almost within these houses, right? So you get this idea, and also this, so this is almost sort of rose to the level of propaganda, according to critics and historians. And propaganda, they more and more found it necessary to defend. So then the figure of the mother and the lady, lady of the house came about, and justifying more and more the necessity for women to sort of be removed from work, to stay within the household, and to engage with sort of certain activities, certain genteel activities that were recommended for women, and such as looking after the education of the children. So all that sort of comes into play in the novel, and you find at some point, Charlotte Bronte and through her, I guess, the protagonist Jane are actually battling with some of these perceptions. So, if for her, as Dr. Melissa said, it's you know, you find her as an orphan, you know, from rags to riches. I mean, from starting from nowhere, and then you expect her to. I mean, she finds herself that in a position that she cannot simply, you know, go by these social dictates. She cannot. She can't abstain from working. She has to work. She has to find work, and then she finds there are limitations. There are certain things she can do. So actually, this question of what might a woman do, or what might a lady do? Because she's speaking about the genteel, the middle classes. I mean, not that she's sort of unaware of what goes you know, in the upper circles and I guess in the lower classes as well, but she's chiefly concerned about the middle classes and this question, what might a woman do? What can a woman do? What is it a respectable woman can do without sort of declining into some sort of disrepute? So that becomes a very, very you know, resounding question in the novel.
Yeah, thank you, Nipuni. Before I invite you, Melissa, let me read a quotation to inspire this discussion. This is Jane Eyre saying, "Wicked and cruel boy," I said, "you're like a murderer, you're like a slave driver, you're like the Roman emperors." Okay, over to you. That's
yeah. Yes, this idea of confinement and restriction is so visible in this novel, and Jane's reaction to that is so visceral as well. She's really angry at being confined to various roles that she has to play as a woman of a certain class, but who's born with nothing really. You can really sense her frustration with that. And very much so, that at that time, there were few options for women. You really needed to marry. The pressure to marry, especially of certain classes, was quite high. And so marriage was not seen as a thing that was about love. And again, that's where we see this novel is so revolutionary, because she is choosing love over marriage for class purposes. And that in and of itself is a very interesting reflection of the society. But I'd also say, you know, as someone from a formerly colonized space of England as well, just like Sri Lanka, what we see in this novel is not just a woman who is reacting to class restrictions or gender restrictions, but also the kind of colonial presence there, because Victorian women, British women were sort of, white women were held up to certain standards and then contrasted with what was seen in the colonies or former colonies, where these spaces were, the information that was coming in, I should say, from travelers, from this time of a lot of movement and change, that's also reflected in this novel, Charlotte Bronte's sort of perceptions of far-off spaces. So that Victorian ideal of womanhood is set against not just people from quote-unquote lower socioeconomic classes within England, for example, but also against people, white and people of color from the colonies, those people as well. So race comes into play. It's very visible in this, I think, as well. And then I would also just say that two more things. One is that Charlotte Bronte is drawing from, in part, from her own life. Now, this is not her own autobiography, even though it's Jane Eyre, an autobiography, it's Jane Eyre's story. But Charlotte Bronte and her sister also, they went to Belgium to become teachers. They had to address these things. And even she struggled. She turned down a marriage proposal early in life. And then she accepted one that wasn't exactly for love, but she was happy. But at the same time, once she got married, she was only married, I think, for less than a year. She died from complications of pregnancy. But still, that was a very happy time, except she also wrote less when she got married. And so you can see this choice that women face, even in her own life, right? Where she's kind of choosing between the pressures of class and gender, and also her own interests and personal desires toward self-expression.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's for students who are watching this. You might have noticed beautiful anecdotal evidence coming from history of Victorian, and kindly understand that you need to go and research these things carefully. And at the same time, the Victorian history books are coming out even now. So things, the way we looked at Victorian times could be changing. Be aware of that. But thank you very much for those beautiful anecdotal evidence and sort of recreating the socio-economic situation under which she wrote.
That is my wife, said he. Such is the sole conjugal embrace I am ever to know. Such are the endearments which are to solace my leisure hours. And this is what I wish to have, laying his hand on my shoulder. This young girl who stands so grave and quiet at the mouth of hell, looking collectedly at the gambols of a demon, I wanted her just as a change after that fierce ragu. Wood and Briggs, look at the difference. Compare these clear eyes with the red balls yonder. This face with that mask, this form with that bulk. Then judge me, priest of the gospel and man of the law. And remember, with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. Off with you now. I must shut up my prize.
Okay, coming back to the text of Jane Eyre, the narrative, the narrativization of a book is an interesting area of study. So could you comment about the narrative techniques of Jane Eyre? Maybe we can start with Nipuni.
Yeah, so I think the idea is that I mean, it's a novel that is very easy to study, I guess, as a Bildungsroman. What is called a Bildungsroman, a novel in which the protagonist or the main character sort of comes into age. I mean, so we see her from her childhood and then on to sort of becoming something that she and we also have to remember that she's actually writing in retrospect, because by the time that she starts her narrative sort of journey, we understand that she has already spent some years in being happily married to Rochester, right? So that's a very so as novels go, we are made to understand that we look for some kind of development and I guess improvement and I guess spiritual and as well as physically, sort of developing yourself and all that. So in terms of all those factors, Jane Eyre sort of appeals to us as a as a novel that addresses all these issues. So I guess one of the main concerns in the novel is sort of how she achieves autonomy, how she sort of becomes what she is now, and also I guess as Dr. Mellis of course pointed this out, her work being autobiographical and the fact that Jane Eyre is also called an autobiography. So I guess it's a fictional autobiography in that sense, but there is of course biographical elements working in there. So and for me personally, one of the main things that I find appealing is her is sort of the spatial journey that Jane undertakes from being a child and the amount of sort of attention or focus that Charlotte Bronte gives travel as well, and as a sort of a narrative technique, as a narrative sort of, if you like, link, combining certain sections in the novel, if you like. So as I see, and I think other critics have spoken about this, there's this you find it as a novel which sort of which is punctuated by certain houses, by the presence of certain houses, the Reeds' house, and then Lowood, and then Thornfield, sort of I guess the stage of all this the climactic sort of action, and then moving on to the Rivers house and the Moore house, and then sort of coming into an ideal, a much more mellow, subdued Ferndean. So I think narratively, I mean, so I guess it speaks of as to how skilled a narrator, how skilled a writer Charlotte Bronte is to sort of connect all this together. And that's being said, I think, of course, houses do feature as a very prominent sort of trope or like a motif within many female writers, many women writers. I guess that comes from women, being sort of women of those times being either by force or by habit or by inclination made to live a large part of their lives inside their houses. So yeah, so that is all there is, I guess, as to structure and
I guess let's listen to Melissa. What narrative techniques?
Yeah, I think building on that idea of this traveling and journey, and on the one hand, Charlotte Bronte is in a kind of long line of stories of journeys, right? Everything from the Odyssey or Monkey King or let's see, I don't know, Basho, traveling through Japan. But think of all of those, they're male characters typically. Even the text that often is referred to as an influence for her, which is Pilgrim's Progress. This is the story of a male character. It's a spiritual pilgrimage. But I do think you get the sense of the pilgrimage in this novel, where Jane is working to better herself in many ways, not just her physical circumstances or her financial circumstances, but herself, her personal self, to become the best version of herself, as we say. I also feel the influence as well of Rousseau's Confessions, even though I don't think that's quite as often talked about. You have to remember that Confessions, just published at the end of the 18th century, was shocking because it was exposing one man's internal life, right? But we take these conventions, which are mainly male, and we put them into this female context, which is in itself very revolutionary. She didn't have a lot of female predecessors to be able to sort of serve as her model or inspiration. So I think we see that she is responding to a literary tradition. The other way that we see it very clearly is in her use of certain Gothic imagery, sometimes called the pathetic fallacy, which is where humans project, particularly in art and literature, they project their experiences and their emotions onto nature. So nature is kind of a reflection of the human experience. It runs throughout the novel, right? We have one example. We have the wind, which is this figure of just terror from the beginning. That first sentence that you read, where you said, there's no possibility of going for a walk today, or no, I can't remember the exact wording, but this is, would you read it again?
Yeah, sure.
Let's just go to that sentence.
It's a very, the first sentence of any novel strikes you. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day.
Right, and so it's this idea that we are, as humans, sort of subject to external conditions, which are also our own emotions projected on the outside. She also talks in that initial paragraph, I think, about the wind howling outside. Over and over, this wind is this ominous presence. And let's be clear, Northern England is also, it can be rainy, cold, and windy. This is her actual, kind of her world, right?
Yep.
But it's what we project on it is this kind of fear and ominous threat from outside, which is really the threat of ourselves, the darkest corners of ourselves.
Yeah. Let me also ask you, the Victorian novelists tended to base their novels on teleology. This is taken from Christianity. The same character you found at the beginning is improved at the end. There's a transition. I think the French and the Russian novelists broke these to pieces. Do you think by sticking into, here the novel, there was no possibility of taking a walk that day, and says, "Dear reader, I married him," so you can see the improvement. Do you think by going into such kind of teleology, she might have certain coincidence? She could have maybe tempered too much with reality to give you a little bit of novel that romantic, idealist. What do you think?
Meaning, do you think she followed the conventions almost too closely?
Too closely, that's what.
I don't know. I think yes and no.
Yeah, I guess it's a little difficult for her. It would have been difficult for her to sort of remove herself, I guess, totally from the conventions that were, I guess. But I always feel a presence, her adult presence, even when you read it from the beginning, I always feel that her adult presence is there, even when she's narrating her life as a child. So I think it is sort of whatever her sort of juvenile experiences are always sort of tempered with what deal of wisdom or maturity she has, if you like. So
yeah, I think it's on the one hand, it's we've kind of demonstrated that progress is not linear. I think we understand that today very well.
Exactly.
Learning something is every time I reread this novel, I learn something new about it, right? So learning is not a linear process, and yet you know, if you go on a pilgrimage, which people do in many cultures today, we still have pilgrimages here in a lot of parts of the world, there are certain structures to that are maybe not so much about your own choices, but are kind of structured by the outside world. And so I don't struggle with that part of the novel. I think it's actually, it enhances the experience, in part because it's told from the perspective of a woman. This is a woman doing these things that historically we haven't seen very often, right? So that's why I think it does, although you're right, it kind of conforms to conventions, it also breaks with them.
Right, okay. So coming, in this interesting discussion, you might have seen the whole notion of narrativization of novel, and you would have seen how sometimes the external influences force you to stick to one pattern of narrativization, but the text ultimately break that convention when you start reading it. So this reminds me of Derrida's idea that, you know, the world is a text. Okay.
Yeah.
It is in vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. Millions are condemned to a stiller doom than mine, and millions are in silent revolt against their lot. Nobody knows how many rebellions, besides political rebellions, ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer, and it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. When thus alone, I not unfrequently heard Grace Poole's laugh, the same peal, the same low, slow ha, ha, which when first heard had thrilled me. I heard, too, her eccentric murmurs, stranger than her laugh.
Okay, now let me go into a little bit of theory, interesting part of the discussion. Okay, is Jane Eyre a feminist novel? Is there any particular reason why it is being taught in feminist literature courses?
Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent question, and something that students sort of ask themselves, ask us at the end of each session. And I think, again, I must say this now, whenever you find a woman writer and a female protagonist, you also tend to automatically assume that it's a feminist novel. But you know, people like Rosalind Coward have sort of cautioned us against this kind of conjecture that it might not always be the case. But having said that, Jane Eyre does, as we spoke about before, does break several fictional traditions of that age. And I mean, to recap, it was after all an age which was dominated by great male authors. And so I guess what feminist literary theorists and you know, people who are concerned about feminist literary theory, what they feel is that on one hand, people like Charlotte Bronte are working with new traditions. They create new traditions. They set standards for people who are succeeding, who are coming behind them, for writers, you know, who sort of appear even generations later. They provide inspiration. So from that angle, I think Jane Eyre is very, very important. And on the other hand, what feminists write, especially people like, you know, Elaine Showalter and then even Gilbert and Cuba, who we might actually speak about later. But what they feel about is that people like Charlotte Bronte, their writing has to be re-examined, not just not just for what they offer, but for what are the potential, what are the aspects that would have sort of escaped our notice or escaped the notice of critics or writers or students who were engaging with the text at that moment, at that moment in time. So when you do that, when you go back and actually revisit some of these traditions, you encounter very interesting, very intriguing phenomena, and then you might even treat a character or a relationship between between two characters in a totally new light, and that is of course an ongoing life, and I guess that is the beauty of literature, that's why we keep on reading, and I think that when Dr. Schindler mentioned that each time you read the novel you come into different perspectives. So I think these two angles, on one hand creating new literary traditions, and on the other hand unearthing and that I guess has to come from us, from the readers and the people who engage with the writing. So judging by those two aspects, I would definitely say that it has a lot of feminist potential, and a lot of potential as a feminist novel.
Yeah, and to build on that, there's, I think, a really useful, very contemporary concept called the Bechdel test, which was created by Alison Bechdel. I believe she's a graphic novelist, cartoonist. But Alison Bechdel made this test principally for movies that has 3 parts, and we use it still today. It says, number 1, a movie or a text should pass all of these to sort of be a feminist or sort of strongly female-centered text, right? Number 1, does the text have 2 female characters, and do they have names? Jane Eyre passes this one, right? Number 2, do those female characters, do they talk to each other? Passes that test, right? And number 3, do they talk to each other about something other than a man? It passes that test, right? Now, mind you, today, the movie, a bunch of films made today, Oppenheimer, released recently, right, in recent years, Lord of the Rings, the whole trilogy, The Avengers, those films, Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, those films don't pass this test, right? Created much later. Then I suppose also the books that inspired them didn't pass that test, but Jane Eyre passes this really simple and very useful kind of test of whether or not this is a kind of featuring fully fledged female characters. So I think it's pretty inspiring that and that it does do this, and that it inspired a lot of other writers.
Exactly.
Virginia Woolf. I mean, think of the other writers who can owe a lot to Charlotte Bronte and her sisters and other female novelists.
And I guess even the more popular novels, novelists like Daphne du Maurier, Rebecca, and all those. So I think when you really examine, I think even much more popular texts, even the Mills and Boons, which are sort of regarded as, sort of a subgenre of, I guess. So this idea of, it's very, I think, sort of pertinent to say that Jane Eyre or Charlotte Bronte actually set a lot of influence, to even to these characters. And I always also wanted to sort of mention, building on what Dr. Schindler said about females talking to each other. There's a lot of female conversation actually happening in Jane Eyre, and especially in the Lowood sections, and then again.
And they're not about men.
Right. Not about men, exactly, unless they are sort of, I guess inspired by Brocklehurst and leaving those episodes aside. I think that these interactions with Mrs. Temple, Miss Temple, sorry, and Helen Burns, and then
her friend, her
River sisters, I guess. So
one of the misconceptions of Jane as a feminist text is the fact that she hits men back. That misconception might be construed as feminism, in the sense that even the description of Brocklehurst is not very kindly. The fact that she always goes and challenges them, that might be. I think this is where the theory and the reality might clash, overlap. What do you think about that? Are females supposed to go and hit back, or feminism is something else?
Oh, yeah.
I guess you
go ahead.
No, I guess, of course, sort of defense and attack also. I mean, you cannot sort of remove those from being a feminist and your sort of overall feminist experience and sensibilities. And I guess that I think we were having another discussion on this, and we realized that certain writers, I think, approach this method in different ways. And I think Charlotte Bronte, sort of her sensibilities are so that she's just, I think, naturally very passionate, and she's very reactive and proactive. And for instance, take the proposal scene between Rochester and Jane, and I mean, it does happen in very very romantic setting. Now we were talking about storms, so all that is sort of arrested, and we have a very traditional Midsummer's England sort of English sort of setting for that. But despite all this, there's a lot of violence in that, even in that potential sort of setting for love and romance. And Jane almost sort of proposes to Rochester. I mean, it's like, I know Rochester proposes to Jane, but there's a lot of violence in the fact that Rochester is has been sort of manipulating her emotionally, and she hits back against that. So I guess you cannot sort of I don't know, disrespect or sort of not sort of acknowledge the power that she sort of exercises there. But I do agree with the fact that it's not all there is to being a feminist text. Maybe Dr. Schindler would like to add something to.
Yeah, I think that's an unfortunate kind of reputation that has been attributed to feminism, angry feminist.
They call it the bra-burning feminist.
There we go. Yeah,
I guess, yeah.
And I mean, I think the passage you read where Jane is sort of reacting to, this is the one
John.
she's John.
Yeah.
Let's be realistic. They're young, and John is annoying.
Yeah,
and who
yeah.
hasn't experienced a younger sibling or cousin? Men too. I mean, but the problem was it's okay for a
Well,
man
you
to be
basically want
irritated.
to hit someone with a
Right,
book.
yeah, because
I
it's
think that's
so
a monster.
normal.
Mm.
I mean, everyone who's had any siblings or cousins, or
most
neighboring
relatable,
kids,
yeah.
we know this experience, right?
Yeah.
It's just that as a genteel, kind of Victorian woman, she's, again, white woman, she's expected to behave in a certain way from a young age. And although she learns some of those societal expectations, she learns to conform to some extent. She also learns to give a rise to her own autonomy. She makes her own choices. And so she channels her emotions. Maybe that's the learning that happens for Jane. She learns to channel her emotions to make the decisions that are right for her. So she's very sort of manipulated by Rochester. And she points that out. She's like, hey, hang on. This is not right. And I'm going to go, and I'm not going to stand for this. And then when she goes back to him, which I think, opposite to your point, people see that as anti-feminist. She goes back to this man who was kind of manipulative of her, and maybe he.
But for the record, I guess she does come on her own terms.
She makes her own choice, and this is the point that's been made about this, right? She's going back because she feels a connection of mind, body, and soul. She's connected to this man in deeper ways. Did they get annoyed with each other? Yes.
I'm sure they do.
Because this is what it's like to be in a romantic relationship or any kind of relationship with another human, to experience that full spectrum of human emotions. So I think that's really, I hope that we can revise this idea of feminism, whatever you want to call it. It's not just an angry bra-burning woman, but a woman who maybe experiences the full spectrum of humanity.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So for students who are studying feminist theory, be aware that the feminist manifesto is much more larger than burning your bra or hitting.
Yeah.
It's much more very subtle. It's something to do with power, dismantling the power structures in and around us, and like you said, experiencing the world, without this notion of power going from one side to the other. Okay.
He ran headlong at me. I felt him grasp my hair and my shoulder. He had closed with a desperate thing. I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer. I felt a drop or two of blood from my head trickle down my neck, and was sensible of somewhat pungent suffering. These sensations, for the time, predominated over fear, and I received him in frantic thought. I don't very well know what I did with my hands, but he called me rat, rat, and bellowed out aloud. Aid was near him. Eliza and Georgiana had run for Mrs. Reed, who was gone upstairs. She now came upon the scene, followed by Bessie and her maid Abbott. We were parted. I heard these words, "Dear, dear, what a fury to fly at Master John. Did ever anybody see such a picture of passion?" Then Mrs. Reed subjoined, "Take her away to the Red Room and lock her in there." 4 hands were immediately laid upon me, and I was borne upstairs.
I'm coming into one of the very extraordinary themes in the novel, the idea of madness. Let's talk a little bit about the madness in the novel, keeping in mind that this notion is only projected to females in the novel.
So I would say that, yeah, definitely in the Victorian, in a lot of like sort of fictions coming from the Victorian era, you do see madness, you know, as a trope, as a motif, and you do tend to associate a lot of madness with women also. So I think it ties up with a lot of perceptions about women as vulnerable, women as more sort of prone to be overstimulated and you
Hysteria.
know. Hysteria,
medical concept.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think the term hysteria comes from
hysteria, basically a womb.
Yeah, right. So the fact that your womanhood has something to do with
it's the source of your madness.
Exactly, the source of madness. And so you find this this figure of Bertha as mad, and then that is, I think, has been extensively sort of studied and taken apart by critics. And so I remember this note on this by a critic called Johanna Fellman, actually, who seems to feel that, you know, for women to actually exist in a patriarchal world and to sort of survive there, sometimes they have to sort of speak the language of they have to speak the language of patriarchy and sort of get approved or to sort of stand apart as a dissenter and then to run the risk of being identified as mad. I think that is what I use mad under inverted commas, but I think that is what basically happens with Bertha. But having said that, I think Dr. Schindler mentioned that there are a few, like you know, many interesting layers to this novel. So I think again sort of tying it up with what I said earlier about feminist literary theory and feminist literary criticism also being about how you can revisit a text, you know, a text that was written hundreds of years ago. Still we can, and so there are critics who have done this. For instance, Gilbert and Guba in Mad Woman in the Attic, as you know, a reference to Bertha, who actually speak about how Bertha and Jane actually sort of mirror each other to a certain extent. How they actually argue that Bertha could be sort of an external manifestation for Jane, but so ironically, Rochester sees them as very different from each other. Rochester sees them as sort of polar opposites. So at one point, I think when their wedding is called off, he says, compare these two women, compare the calmness of one and the sort of the raging of the other. But actually, when you really study the novel, there are many instances where when Jane rages herself.
Absolutely.
I think
the Red Room.
Exactly, at the Red Room, and then against Jean Reed, and then at many instances she suppresses rage. So sometimes critics do feel that this suppression sort of she puts even against Rochester, and that somehow is a sort of manifestation of an external manifestation where you see Bertha dealing with that rage and anger. So it's very interesting, this concept of madness and how Charlotte Bronte deals with that.
Yeah, and it's I mean, I think Gilbert and Gruber also talk about women writers or creators at that time really having two options for how to depict women. They were either the sort of angel in the house, or they were the
mad
the mad woman, right? So there's no shades of gray between those, yeah. And I think that what although Bertha becomes this sort of other to Jane, the novel opens up, even now, the possibility of us going back and kind of finding other women writers or sort of creators who were exposing this paradox. So I'm thinking in particular of the Mexican writer Sor Juana de la Cruz, who was actually a predecessor to the Bronte. She wrote before, but she also pointed out this ridiculous paradox. She actually, to avoid marriage, went and became a nun because it allowed her to continue studying and educating herself. But she talks about this, like, we are either expected as women to be, you know, the mad, wild, promiscuous, or an angel, and there's no opportunities between these two. So Jane Eyre, in many ways, in kind of opening, as an early predecessor in this feminist movement, can open the possibility to look back and reconnect with older texts that we may have forgotten or have been erased by history.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that concept of that mad woman in the attic is so, it's still used so commonly today, right? We still talk about this concept that was started by Charlotte Bronte.
Of course. This whole notion of madness as a sort of a trope in literature and madness as a serious issue that the psychologists studied. I think this novel brought a lot of attention to that through the depiction of Bertha and her actions. Even I as a reader was like little confused because Bertha knew how to steal the key, open the door and come out, you know, so almost like, you know, figuring out how this whole
you understand that her madness has maybe sane sort of.
Well, I think that's what she says. That's what she says in White. That's what she does in White Sargasso is to say that this is not a woman. I mean, she was essentially her madness is constructed by Rochester. After all, he puts her in a cage. He locks her up, and then wouldn't anyone become mad being locked up in a cage, tied down?
Yeah, and he justifies his action later. That this is why I did it.
Right.
So it brings out a lot of. I mean, this whole notion of madness depicted in the novel, or madness depicted anywhere, brings more questions than answers. That's what I want you to remember as you read the novel.
It seemed, sir, a woman, tall and large, with thick and dark hair, hanging long down her back. I know not what dress she had on. It was white and straight, but whether gown, sheet or shroud, I cannot tell. Did you see her face? Not at first, but presently she took my veil from its place. She held it up, gazed at it long, and then she threw it over her own head and turned to the mirror. At that moment, I saw the reflection of the visage and features quite distinctly in the dark oblong glass. And how were they? Fearful and ghastly to me. Oh, sir, I never saw a face like it. It was a discolored face. It was a savage face. I wish I could forget the roll of the red eyes and the fearful blackened inflations of the lineaments. Ghosts are usually pale, Jane. This, sir, was purple. The lips were swelled and dark, the brow furrowed, the black eyebrows widely raised over the bloodshot eyes. Shall I tell you of what it reminded me? You may. Of the foul German spectre, the vampire. Ah, what did it do? Sir, it removed my veil from its gaunt head, rent it in two parts, and flinging both on the floor, trampled on them.
Okay, let us talk about this whole idea of experiences that, say, female readers can sort of identify with this in the novel. Before that, let me just read one experience from Jane, so that this might inspire you. She tells Helen, "But I feel this, Helen, I must dislike those who, whatever I do to please them, persist in disliking me. I must resist those who punish me unjustly. It is as natural as that I should love those who show me affection or submit to punishment when I feel it is deserved." So that is Jane's experience. So maybe we could divert the discussion to Bertha Mason's experience.
Yeah, so this idea of, I mean, when we speak about texts being perceived as feminist, I think there's this question that people ask, can there be a shared literary experience that will sort of please and that will sort of relate to all women, and on the other hand, that all women sort of find relatable. So that is, I think, a dilemma, I think, which has been, I think, haunting a lot of writers and readers and critics alike. So especially, I think a lot of feminist critics, especially those from the third wave, people like Adrienne Rich, even people like Alice Walker, Bonnie Zimmerman, sort of grappled with this issue and actually contested this idea of and I guess much of the second wave feminist literary output coming from sort of white middle class sort of enclosures, and how other feminists who sort of identify themselves with other regions, other cultures, they might not exactly see an experience that is projected as feminist, as empowering, when it's taken from their angle. So for obviously people characters who come into mind are people like Bertha Mason. But before that, I'm also struck by how, of course, this is a novel about repression. We spoke about this, from childhood itself. Jane is repressed by various figures and various institutions. So it is a novel about repression, but still, coming from all that, you still find that Jane has. Jane is privileged, despite all the repression that she undergoes. She's still privileged, because there are many occasions in the novel where she identifies herself as a lady, as a gentle woman, as a member of the genteel class, as a member of the class who can read and write. So this, in many occasions, sets her apart from other characters around her. For instance, people like Grace Poole, this minor character, this aide to Bertha Mason, Rochester's first wife, and then at the Rivers house again she meets this caregiver, this nanny-like figure, who sort of questions her, judging by her apparel and the way she dresses. Are you a lady? And that sort of sets the sort of tone for her, and then that is the way in which she sort of wants to be addressed, and she's very adamant in saying that I'm a lady, I have read, I'm educated, and that is my identity. But then you find that there are many
characters
who don't have that privilege. So I think maybe Dr. Schindler would like to talk more on this, especially with regards to how we perceive Jane, as a white woman, and how her whiteness sometimes is sort of taken for granted.
Yeah, although from a narrative perspective, it's reinforced because she's often described as extremely pale, sort of fragile. Yeah. Although she's trying constantly to work against that idea, that depiction, because she's trying to sort of exert her strength. But whether regardless of that narrative, there is also her sort of antagonist, which is Bertha Mason, and it's a bit of a spoiler alert as we talk about Bertha, but this idea of class, and from the perspective of third wave feminism, which says we need to consider the kind of consider a network of kind of experiences. So you are shaped by your experiences of class, gender, race, and many other things, nationality, and so on, right? So some of the other female characters who are white, but who may not have the class privilege that Jane has, many of them still have a voice. But Bertha Mason really does not have a voice. So to points made by Gayatri Spivak, can the subaltern speak? Bertha never really speaks in this text. She laughs a lot, that laughter is sort of a manifestation of her madness, right? But supposedly, but her own experience is not. It's not legible here, and she kind of serves as a plot device. She's not multidimensional. She's a very flat character, right? And I think in this way, Charlotte Bronte is a reflection of her times, right? Where Bertha Mason is a white Creole woman. So she is white, but she has lived, or she did live in the West Indies, Jamaica most likely. She was born there, probably generations there. So these are people who are kind of in between. They are not considered to be like white English people, right? Western people. They're in many ways orientalized, to use Said's concept. But they're also not people of color from the West Indies. And so they're this sort of in-between space. And she's also a reflection of the power dynamic at the time. You could lock someone up, especially women, without any, they didn't have to, there was no reason. A husband could lock up a wife, which is what Rochester does to his first wife, right? So this idea of Jane Eyre being a universal experience, I don't think that her experience is universal. This is what we learned from third wave feminism. That being said, I do think that Charlotte Bronte wrote this novel with kind of layers of coded text, and she opened the possibility to think even about Bertha Mason, and we see that manifested in what's called a prequel to this novel written by Jean Rhys, Wide Sargasso Sea, which tells Bertha's story and does make her a fully dimensional character. Jane is just a mere blip in that story. So, Bronte was really very much a reflection of her times, a kind of colonialist, Orientalist view. She still opened the window of possibility for other future feminist writers to explore these dimensions also of color and race.
Yeah, of course. This whole notion of Bertha Mason not being able to articulate herself, that giving her a voice became an entire area of study in feminism.
Yeah.
So like you said, Jane Eyre and even Bronte and even Austen, they set in motion the pioneering wave of work for which gave rise to so many other areas of study as so many other novelists and so many other ways of thinking. So which makes coming back to our original sort of discussion thread, whether Jane Eyre, the novel should be still studied in the 21st century literature classroom. I think we made more than enough points for that. So, which brings me to the conclusion of this, and let me conclude with a passage from the novel. For me, this is not the ending, but this is the actual end for me. This is what she says. Then he stretched his hand out to be led. I took the dear hand, held it a moment to my lips, and then let it pass round my shoulder. Being so much lower of stature than he, I served both for his prop and guide. We entered the wood and wandered homeward. So now that's what we are going to do now. Of course, you saw in that passage how, as our discussion clearly suggested, Jane finds her own agency, both love and love love in her own terms. So there you are. With that, I would like to bring this discussion to an end. This video on Jane Eyre, initiated by the Department of Language Studies, is the second video in a sort of a larger series of literary texts that we wish to bring, so that students can expand their horizons. These are not sort of, you cannot not read the book and come and watch this and go and study. This is supposed to help you with your book, expand your horizons, get you to read more books, get you to read more about feminism, the Victorian history, and sort of inspire you. So I need to thank Dr. Melissa Schindler, from Associate Professor English from the University of North Georgia, and of course Ms. Nipuni Ranivir from the Department of Language Studies, and the great team of cameramen, directors, and what is called people who are in the backdrop, whom can't be seen from SetMe. So we thank you very much.